Hello there. My name is Chris Kerswell. I work as part of the solution engineering team here at Redgate Software. And today I want to look at some of the explicit reasons that you might consider moving from the SQL Toolbelt Essentials and upgrade effectively into the full SQL Toolbelt. So I'm going to be going through, these three key topics. One, I want to introduce the idea of Database DevOps itself, just have a quick look into that and effectively define what we mean by that a little bit more. I'm then going to apply that to the actual toolbelt tiers so we can see where that applies to the toolbelt itself and see how that applies in terms of upgrading to the full toolbelt. I then want to go into the explicit components that are available in both tiers and what that actually will bring you, highlighting some of the more valuable areas. I'm then going to jump into a quick demonstration of those as well. So we're just going to go through and effectively see those little processes changing in action. All right, so starting off by looking at Database DevOps as a concept. So we at Redgate think of this in terms of these four key pillars, effectively tying in very nicely to standard topics within DevOps. So starting top left, standardizing team-based work. So if we have a team of people, how do we make sure they're all singing from the same song sheet? How do we make sure that our development practices are aligned across our stack? In terms of the database itself, that quite simply can mean bringing in something like source control or loading up test data or giving visibility into the database or documentation, or there's a lot of different components of this, and we'll have a look at some of those in a second. Moving on from that, we have a basis with standardization that we can build into with automation. So once we have those processes that are built up, how do we start to remove a lot of the manual work? How do we introduce some of the, the bread and butter of DevOps that a lot of people think of when they think of DevOps? Things like CI and CD, but for the database. And then visibility. So you have a body of work effectively being done by your database engine. How do you see what's being done in that body of work? This is something that operations teams and DBAs are very, very familiar with. Essentially monitoring that database, being able to understand when things are going wrong and how to make that more efficient. But very useful, I'd say, for development teams as well, so that they can be a bit more proactive. And if we think about this modern world where operations are coming and being part of the development team a lot more, now I don't see there's any reason why we couldn't do that effectively with the tooling we see as well. Something we're not going to go into in as much detail today is going to be the provisioning piece, but this is very important as well. If we think about the ideas of how we handle infrastructure a lot more intelligently these days, you have things like containers, you have infrastructure as code, all of these bits and pieces to very easily manage our infrastructure. Provisioning, a very important part of that. As I said, that's a topic for another time. Okay, so the toolbelt itself breaks down into two tiers. We have the toolbelt essentials, and then we have the full toolbelt. And when it comes to the actual pillars of that database DevOps concept, I've highlighted here just how those two things, or the coverage of those two things, looks. Explicitly, Toolbelt Essentials is very much for the standardization element. So getting a team of developers, more in tune with database development or more modern database development, introducing the idea of source controlling a database, for example, that's very useful. The full toolbelt, on the other hand, is much more focused on unlocking some of the advanced topics. So taking automation, for example, and enabling that for the database, or giving visibility to the entire team based upon the work that's actually happening in that database. If we break that out into the actual technologies that are happening here, this is what that looks like in a bit more detail. So we're going to start off with the standardization piece. So again, this is what the Toolbelt Essentials will bring you. So fundamentally, we usually focus on source controlling that database. So taking a team of developers, giving them a source control platform, very handy, very useful, because we capture work. It means that we can collaborate a little bit better. It means that you can have separate database environments for one database project. Very handy, very useful. With the full tool belt, the automation piece, as I mentioned earlier, enables that CI and CD side. So how do we integrate our database effectively with something like a build server? You may have something you use already, Azure DevOps, Jenkins, Bamboo, whatever it might be. TeamCity, another example. So how do we get that functionality, that value that we've already started seeing in other development teams, and how do we make that work for the database as well? So we're going to have a look at that in a second. We can then take that further, start looking at CD. So we have, software again like Azure DevOps, so Bamboo, or frequently we see Octopus deploy as well. How do we take that code, release that in an automated way to testing or QA or UAT environments? Again, I'm going to show you how we can do that. And then the final topic we're going to touch on, database monitoring and giving you a bit of insight into the work that's being done by a database. What this means is that we effectively put a bit of software in to continuously track and provide metrics for the database. Again, a big theme of DevOps is essentially putting metrics in and then looking to improve upon that. And there is a sense that we can apply that same logic here, essentially getting metrics out for the database, run a release, then see what changed before and after running that release. So if that release is focused on performance, very, very handy, gives us something to go on, something to continuously improve upon. In terms of the details for what's different between the two tiers, so the Toolbelt Essentials does give you a lot of different individual components. So that list is what you can see here. Now I'm not going to go through each and every one of those. It's a great source of value because if you want 3 of these things, then you effectively get a whole bunch of other stuff for a good pricing tier. But we want to look at how we can extend this and what we unlock by upgrading to the full tool belt. So that's these 3 layers at the top. So in terms of the actual explicit products that are unlocked, so first of all, backup is provided. That's something I'm not going to go into today. For some people that might be of interest. The 2 key ones are the SQL Monitor application and SQL Change Automation application. So the Change Automation application is what's going to enable us to do the automation piece. SQL Monitor application is what's going to enable us to get visibility into the work being done by the database. So it's those 2 that I'm now going to focus on in this quick demo. All right, so let's have a quick look. All right, so I'm standing up this VM here, and in this I have a number of databases. Now what the Essentials Toolbelt will give you is, as I mentioned, source controlling, the ability to run comparisons, for example, the ability to run queries more efficiently or write queries more efficiently with SQL prompt. So all of this is very useful. Let's think about the day in the life of a developer who has access to that. What I can do is I can open up my environment. So I'm going to be looking at my SQL Server Central dev environment, and I'm going to be making a few fairly straightforward, fairly standard changes. What I can do here is I can say make a new table change. What I'm going to do is just add in a new column. to this contacts table. So the contacts table we have here is basically capturing contact information. And I'm going to say, okay, we want to also capture Twitter handles. So I'm going to add a new column for that. Okay, very useful or very easy. One thing that I might want to do from that is see what might be affected from that. So a small tool from the tool belt that we can very easily use for this is the Dependency Tracker. So let's find my contacts table. That's right here. And I'm just going to quickly get rid of everything else from this. So a quick trick that you might not know of, if you select connected objects, then invert, that grabs everything else, hide, and now if I reapply the layout, we'll just focus on this object here, so the contacts table right here. So we can see the dependencies being used here. I'm just going to quickly change this to a hierarchic view as I find that a bit easier to see. So we can see that we have a number of stored procedures here. Maybe we want to change those in line with the change we just made to this, so we make sure that that's captured along with this change. Alternatively, I might want to write out a brand new stored procedure. So I'm going to add in a very basic stored procedure again, and I've got SQL prompt. So I can use things like code snippets. I have to remember my naming convention for stored procedures here. And I'm just going to grab everything from my contacts table. And because I'm using prompts, I can do things like very easily take away or identify bits of the code that maybe can be cleaned up a little bit more. Or maybe if I want to reformat this, that's very easy. So I can change that to a collapse style, then Control KY to realign that code. All right then, so we have that new stored procedure. I'm going to execute that and we'll have that added to the database. Something else I could do here then is I could add in some new data. So typically what we might do here is that we might have some example, we refer to it at Redgate a lot as static data. Generally in the industry you might think of that as lookup data or reference data or config data. Effectively data within any table really that is controlled by development. That's how I always tend to think of it. Data that is done by developers or managed by developers, and therefore work that is done by developers as well. And that's going to be important in a second. Okay then, so we have here our list of countries with their associated country codes. As I said, a standard lookup table. And I'm going to add in a new country. So the country I'm going to add in, we're going to assume that the moon has maybe been colonized. And so we need a new entry for the moon. So I'm going to give the moon ZZ. All right then. So again, we have the ability here from the Essentials toolbelt to use SQL Source Control. And this enables me to link that particular database, so the SQL Server Central Dev database that I've been working with, and I can link that to a source control repository. And the repository I've used here is my SQL Server Central repository in so this is an Azure DevOps on server installation. So you can see here I've got my database folder, and within that database folder we have things like the tables, and you can see my contacts table. So this is stored as a create script. The SQL Source Control plugin has created this script when we first checked this in, and now I'm going to want to modify this. Very easily done. I do that by coming into my commit tab within SQL Source Control. So we can see here those 3 changes that I've just made. You have the contacts table, we have my new store procedure, and then we have that country code. So that's a new insert. A quick highlight, but you'll notice that the store procedure is well formatted in the way that I wanted that to be formatted. I'll add in a useful comment. I hope in reality that would be a lot more informative, but just for today, I'll put in a bit of a garbage comment. The plugin then does basically all the heavy lifting behind the scenes. So it essentially has already identified that those few things are, well, relevant to us to check in. So it's highlighted those for us. It allows us to check that in very easily to our source control repository. And it manages the actual check-in of that behind the scenes, and it'll update those scripts for me as well. Okay, so if we want to see that or prove that, easiest way is just to refresh this screen. And what we're going to see is that contacts table now updated to have that Twitter line as well. So you can just see that right there. So the plugin, as I said, doing the heavy lifting for us, so we can focus on the things that we provide that add value. So we can now do our development work. We can get more done. We don't have to worry about, say, manually updating this. And now when it's time to actually think about deploying this code, there's a couple of different ways that we can deploy, say, from our dev environment to one of our testing environments. Now, what we might want to do is, it's been a period of time, maybe it's been a sprint, maybe it's been a little bit longer, and we want to actually take all of that code, we want to move it into our testing environment. And so the way we can very easily do that, again, with something that's provided by the Toolbelt Essentials, is to use our comparison tools. So here we've got the Schema Compare tool. We can set that as our source. And so here we can take our dev database, and I'm going to take my testing database as my target. So we have the source target relationship. And very usefully, we can also go direct from source control. So we'd always recommend going from a single source of truth, so the source control environment, especially if we have a distributed team who are working on their own database environments. Very important we go from source control rather than going from the individual database. And so instead of, say, writing out a change script myself, or maybe taking the scripts that are in the source control repository and adapting them, what we can do with SQL Compare is quite simply run the compare engine over the top and take, or I guess generate, a change script from those changes. Now, one quick change I'm going to make here, I've got the SQL Test framework installed, so I don't want to include any of those objects within that comparison, so I'm just going to check that box. Again, quick trick if you've never seen that one before. Okay then, let's have a look at that. So we have those 2 changes that have been highlighted to my schema. Obviously, SQL Compare only running on the schema. If we want to compare the data, we have the data comparison option instead. And I can see the actual individual changes here as well. If I want to take these and deploy these, we can do that through the application, or we can create a deployment script. Let's have a look at that change script. And then we can just take that script, execute it, maybe send it to someone who is relevant, and again, they could execute it, or we could actually run that through the application ourselves if we have the authorization to do that. Okay, so that makes things very easy, very streamlined. I'm not going to do that just yet. One thing that I might want to do beforehand again here, so we have our SQL Test application. This essentially provides a wrapper around the T-SQL-T framework, enables very easy unit testing. I've made some changes, so maybe I want to run these tests and validate the changes haven't fundamentally broken anything, or that I've not made any fundamental errors in my code. I haven't, we're good, we continue. Maybe I should have done that before I checked the code into source control, but that's a lesson to be learned for next time, I guess. Okay, so there's a few bits and pieces from the Essentials Toolbelt that can make development work for, especially for the database, a lot easier and essentially a lot more streamlined, a lot more in line with what we'd expect if we're working on other elements of the stack. What I want to show you now, though, is how we can take some of those processes and make them even more efficient. And the first trick, I guess, is automating off the back of that. So I've done those changes and I've deliberately not pushed them through using Compare to my testing environment. And the reason for that is that effectively, while it's still pretty streamlined, is still manual work. What I want to do is deploy those changes out completely seamlessly, completely automatically. Now I'm hoping that in the background, I've talked for enough time that the changes themselves have automatically deployed to my first environment. And so this integration environment, yeah, there we go. You can see that there, the Twitter column's been automatically deployed to the integration environment. And so we could actually set this up so that we automatically deploy to testing or to wherever else as well. I want to basically go through the same steps. So again, rewind a bit. Let's get to the point where we've just checked our code into source control. And again, I'm going to validate that that code is here. So Azure DevOps gives us the ability to run builds. Of course, again, something I mentioned earlier, but we could be running this in TeamCity or in Bamboo or whatever your particular build server software of choice is. So the Azure DevOps pipeline I've set up here. First of all, we run a build automatically. You can see I'll add in a useful comment. That's my not so useful commit message showing up. And we've kick-started this build process. And these two steps here, so the build step and my test step, those are the important steps. So if we have a closer look at that, we can see what's going on. Essentially, we're using Azure DevOps as the manager of this process, so our release manager. And we're going to start off by running a database build. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but the way I've got it set up here is to bootstrap a new database and run that code against our database. So here we have essentially run all that code. We're also going to do a schema validation as well. And that essentially gives us the initial smoke test. It gives us the initial bit of feedback that the code we've written will fundamentally run in another environment. Very useful, very handy. It now means that we can take that code and run it in other environments with the assurance that we know that it's not fundamentally broken. If it didn't run, the developer, so me in this case, would get that feedback immediately. There's a 30-second delay after checking in, but pretty promptly that something's gone wrong. The build would fail, it wouldn't deploy to other environments automatically. And so I can go in and actively fix that rather than waiting a couple of months uh, and when that fails to deploy, when I run my compare engine, for example, then having to go back and fix it. You remember we ran SQL Test? Well, we can also do that here as well automatically. So you can see, again, going through the same process. So this is our plugin coming into play here. And you can see these test results at the bottom here. So we've run in the testing framework on top of everything else and got extra validation from those tests. That gives us a NuGet package that we can use in other environments. And that NuGet package basically containing all of our code from source control. When we have a NuGet package, again, the system that I've set up here is that we are going to release that package out to our first environment. So that's been released to integration right there. And that's why that Twitter column was in integration. So we deploy automatically to integration in this setup. In your setup, you could have this going to testing, to acceptance, to production completely seamlessly. Maybe put some automated testing in the pipeline as well. But fundamentally, it's the same story as builds. So we are using Azure DevOps to run this, but it's actually the plugin from us at Redgate that bridges the gap between the two technologies. All right, so I'm ready to deploy to testing. Let's hit deploy. This can be all run by, well, the operations team, by the development team, maybe by the change management team. And I just want to have a quick look at what it's actually doing. So first of all, we're performing the create. That's like you're running compare. It is going to be generating that change script. And then we're going to be deploying that change script afterwards. Quite useful that we can split those two steps into two, because that means that you can also have someone review the change script as well. And so if you do have a process whereby you would need someone to review any change script before it's made, then you can incorporate that into a process like this. But crucially, the manual steps are removed, you get feedback a lot quicker, and that means we can start deploying code out a lot quicker as well. So this step is now running that code. You see database update succeeded. And so once this is complete, we can validate that by having a look at my testing environment, go into that contacts table, and you see the Twitter column right there. Actually, I could also validate that as well if we come back into compare and actually just refresh this. So I'm going to rerun that comparison. Then what we should see here, once this is complete, is that the two environments are now identical. But I haven't had to run compare myself. We've got the code validated with SQL Test. We've had it automatically deployed. So that's one way we can automate. Not the only way though. We could also start thinking about actually source controlling in a slightly different way. Database code is often one that we might want a lot more control over, especially when it comes to automated deployments. Maybe if we're starting to find that we're having to change a lot of those scripts before we're deploying them out, what we might want to do is, well, to use a phrase that's often repeated here at Redgate, shift left, and take that work and do it at the actual source control time rather than at the later stage. So I'm going to do the same again, essentially, but this time I'm going to use a different plugin. Again, this is something that's unlocked with the full Toolbelt. And I'm going to work on this environment now, so this voice of the DBA dev environment. And so I'm going to make just one change this time, just for simplicity. I'm going to add in, again, that Twitter column. Okay, and I'll save that. All right, So what I did previously is I used SQL Source Control to update the change script in the back end. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to use SQL Change Automation. So let me just check that I've saved that. I did. So I'm going to use SQL Change Automation's plugin, and I'm going to do effectively the same thing. So I'm going to use the plugin to generate some code that I'm going to check into Source Control. So far, it should look very similar. So first of all, it's going to check for changes, but when it's done that, we see that we've got my context table right here at the top. And if I open that up, we can see the actual highlighted change between the two. So far, so similar. But the difference is that I can hit generate migrations, and what that's going to do is it's going to generate a change script at this stage rather than generate the change script later. Again, shifting left. What's really nice about this is that you can now change this as much as you want. Oops, typo. You have a lot of control over this change script. You can effectively define the change to be run in the exact way that you want it to be run. Very, very useful, very handy. But just as before, we can then go through that same process. Now, in this case, I'm using a Git repository. So I'm using a Git repository that's hosted in Azure DevOps as it happens as well. So we can run that commit, get that change in my source control repository, and again deploy that change out to my global environment. This time though, the way the pipeline will be structured, so we will still run the build, we'll still run the release in the same way, but the change script won't be generated at deployment time. Instead, the definition of the change script is already there. The deployment execution is effectively to string those together and run that deployment for them. So we can see here, if we have a look at the previous change or commit that's run all the way through to integration. So again, it looks like the same steps, but under the hood, the technology is a little bit different because we're running the actual change in the manner that was described in the change script that we originally committed. Okay, so that gives you an overview on the automation side that is unlocked by using the full tool belt as well. The last piece I want to focus on is the visibility, or I guess the metrics that you can get by looking at monitoring your database environment. Again, this is something that is very common in operations teams or DBA teams to have some kind of software like this, so that we can effectively understand what's going on in the database, get any alerts on anything that's going wrong. Development teams don't often have the access to it though, so I would always recommend that you do get access, even if it's just read-only access, because that essentially means that you can get visibility, you can try and figure out what's going on, and you can be a bit more proactive. And really useful actually if we think about the way that a lot of modern development is going, which is to take operations functions and bring them into the database. A lot of modern software houses these days are looking at the idea of running effectively a team that is dedicated to a product all as one unit, rather than separating out the individual functions. And actually going as far as to give the entire development team then the responsibility, the authority to maintain uptime for that environment. So now this is something that we as developers might have to start thinking about more and more, which is making sure that we know if something's going wrong in that environment. And then again, how to fix it. Here then I can see my instances of SQL Server, so where they're set. And I can see a brief overview of how they're doing based on this red, amber, green traffic light system. This effectively tells me, okay, I've got some environments. Some of them are in the cloud, some of them are doing well, some of them are all right. I've got some environments in production that could use a little bit of cleaning up. I've actually got one testing environment down here that's not going so well. And if I want to open up any of these to have a closer look, I can do so. And we get a lot of information around what's going on in that environment. I'm not going to go into all of this in detail. I'll save that for a future session. But you can see here, for example, the key metrics at the top: CPU, memory, disk I/O, and weights. And what's really important here is that we've actually annotated this graph, so you can see the red blobs that I'm highlighting just there, to just show you if we've made a deployment to that environment. So if we've made a deployment to that particular environment, maybe we want to have a look and review what changed before and after, or what impact that deployment had. Or if we see a big spike and it's just following deployment, then that helps us track back and figure out what's going on. Also, being alerted in the first place, very handy. The red, amber, green actually comes from the alerts that are raised. So essentially, we are continuously monitoring these environments. We're essentially running SQL Server queries and WMI queries and collecting all of that data in a backend DB. And if an event is triggered, or if a threshold is breached for a certain period of time, we can run an alert. We can escalate that to you in, say, Slack or via email, or even now these days we can do that via ServiceNow or via Microsoft Teams. Let's say I'm a developer. I need to make sure that my entire system is running as efficiently as possible. Well, in that case, deadlocks might be something I want to get rid of as much as I can. So here I can have a quick view of that deadlock. I get alerted specifically on deadlocks because that's relevant to me. It's something I can actually look to improve and fix. Here I've got a very quick and easy view of that. I can correct that, and then I can improve that going forward. Alternatively, if I am in the operations team, of course, this is effectively, well, it's a very useful tool really for anyone in a DBA unit. For example, it gives us a view on things like what versions are installed, or something I know that is very popular is how my agent jobs have done, and if we've had any failures. In this case, we're pretty fortunate that we haven't had any of those recently. In any case, there's a lot of different functionality there. I'm going to do another video on SQL Monitor at some point in the future, so we can have a look at all of the bits of functionality in there. But for now, I just want to highlight that it's a great place if you want to understand what's going on in the database, pick apart the individual components or the individual databases, the actual queries themselves, have a look at the performance of them, and look to correct them going forwards. Okay, I hope that that's been useful and informative and given you a good idea of what value can be unlocked by essentially upgrading from Toolbelt Essentials to the full Toolbelt. In summary, what we've seen there is that in the Essentials Toolbelt, we have a lot of tools and functionality to enable database development. But with the full Toolbelt, you get a lot of extra value, mainly with the automation piece. Also with the ability to run migration scripts and manage database code through migration scripts, but also then with the ability to use SQL Monitor to get an overview of what's going on in your production environment and maybe look to correct that. If you've got any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. So my name is Chris Kerswell, that's my email address. You can also find me at sales@red-gate.com or at dbal@red-gate.com, or I'm on LinkedIn, and I'll also leave a description below of all of those mechanisms as well. Finally, if you want to leave a comment below, then I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All the best, and thank you for watching.